Now that you all have ventured into typography, the immediate next step is obviously understanding how font types are segregated and what kind of combinations they come in. Now first, let us start with understanding our font types. The first difference you need to know is this. Whenever you have a small projection at the end of the letters of your font, those are called serifs. So the most obvious difference in between fonts is in the two categories, serif and sans serif. Sans serif literally means without serif, meaning, look at these letters. The letter E has the projections at the end of it, whereas the sans serif version is just composed of simple straight strokes. Now, when you look at a series of fonts, you'll realize that this technique has been used differently. There are different kinds of serifs. There is a slab serif. There are also thin serifs. Whereas even in sans serifs, there are different categories. There are narrow versions, thin, light versions, bold versions, black versions. So all of these are variations within these two major categories of fonts. Whenever you want to design, the first choice is always, do I use a serif font or do I use a sans serif font? The other kinds of fonts are display fonts, that is, fonts that have been created only to communicate a specific visual quality. These qualities make sure that these fonts are not necessarily good for bulk quantities of text, but they are good for titles and headings, such as if you want to create the opening sequence of a movie, for example Star Wars, or if you want to create the heading of a poster, using a display font to choose that kind of characteristic that is conveyed by the movie is usually a good idea. The other kind is script fonts, which have a very natural look and feel and seem to imitate human handwriting. These are some basic categories of fonts. But what is actually important is choosing the right font. Every font has a characteristic look and feel associated with it depending on where you want to use them. Take a look at all of the fonts that have been lined up here. All of them naturally communicate very, very different looks and feels. So, the next thing that you need to remember when it comes to actually dealing with fonts is something called case. Case is basically the capitalization that is used for any piece of text. To put it very simply, uppercase means all the letters are capital. Sentence case means the letters are all small except for the starting letter, which is very similar to how we write a sentence. Only the first letter of the first word in a sentence is made capital. Lowercase means all the letters are small, and title case means the first letter of every word is capital. Other than that, the next thing to keep in mind is something called weight. Weight is basically the thickness of font lettering used. Look at how a single typeface called Avenir has different kinds of fonts. Avenir regular, Avenir Next Ultralight is different, Avenir Next Medium is different, and even bold and heavy or black is gradually thicker. These are some basic categories of font weights. So whenever they say you need to adjust the weight of a font, it literally means changing the thickness of the strokes. A font family, therefore, is basically a set of fonts that have the same characteristic. For example, the letter Y in all of its characteristics are the same, but it will have variations within it in terms of weight. So this font family of Avenir all has some basic common characteristics even though the weight is changing each time. So to clarify, font versus a typeface. A typeface is basically a family. For example, Arial is a typeface. A font is the individual size and characteristic variations of Arial. For example, an Arial Narrow, Arial Italic, Arial size, that is size number 10, size number 12, size number 14 are all different. Now all of these texts that you see where it says this is a separate font, this is a separate font, they're all different sizes. Each of them is a font of their own. However, when you look at it, all of those fonts together belong to the Arial family. This is the basic difference between font versus typeface. A font family effectively creates a typeface. Now let's look at the next thing that we have to consider, that is using these font types effectively. The most important thing to always think about is what look and feel do you want to convey. Now these fonts that you choose can actually make that happen. What font do you want to use for your heading? What do you want to use for your subheading? What to use for your section heading? What font should you use so that the bulk text is actually readable? What font should you use for your captions and highlights? What font should you use to call certain things out? All of these are things that you have to understand when you create a certain visual hierarchy. Typography allows you to play with these things effectively. Now, when you want to use this particularly in branding, you have to identify the right fonts for the right brand. Let us say you are trying to convey a message for a particular brand. You have to ensure that the font you've selected manages to match its qualities. For example, over here, the fonts Cambria, Bodoni and Times New Roman are all three very formal fonts. In contrast, Arial is modern but formal. Impact is very bold. Snell Roundhand is elegant. Now, Marker Felt looks childish and informal, and same with Comic Sans. It looks very childish. Whereas Courier New looks like a typewriter font, which is with very, very specific characteristics. Now, whenever you use and identify fonts for a brand, you have to ensure that they convey its messaging. Look at the same sentence written in 4 different fonts. Each of their characteristics is very, very different. When using a serif font, the message conveyed is one of formality and royalty. When using a display font, here, in this particular case, we have ideas of sci-fi and speed coming to mind. In the other case, a script font basically conveys a very informal and vintage kind of communication, whereas using a narrow, bold, sans serif font conveys a very serious and firm picture to people. Ultimately, fonts make reading fun. Whenever they make any text look interesting, they make it easy for people to see one message and move it to another. So the certain things that you have to consider are style. Does this font match the image that I want to convey? Is the font completely readable? Is this text actually convenient? Is it legible? Can I see all of the letters? And is this font something that is actually convenient for people of all ages and sizes? Is it comfortable? These are things to consider whenever you choose a font. The context in which you read will naturally be different. For example, when you read something on a mobile phone, the size and the legibility will obviously be very different from when you read it on a diagonal surface like a laptop screen, or when you read it on a vertical surface like a poster, or a horizontal surface like a book or a newspaper. This is where not just the fonts you use, but the way you pair them becomes important. Some classic font pairings are given over here. When you pair serif and sans serif, these are a few examples of what things could actually look like. These are some pairings which work fairly well and fairly popular fonts also. Whereas, you can also try and pair sans serif with sans serif fonts where specific characteristics are put across. You could pair a creative or a display font with a very regular serif or sans serif font. Now all of these are variations and completely up to you to experiment and try with regards to your design project. Font selection is one of the most important aspects of creating a design. So naturally, most people usually put in a certain amount of effort to be able to talk about fonts. Take a good look at these logos. What do you think can communicate very well? Look at Tata Motors, where 3 different fonts are used. At the Maggi logo, the Tanishq logo, Disney Plus Hotstar and Coca-Cola Company. All of them have paired and used multiple fonts together, but the impact that they've created is a very specific psychological one that talks about a very clear message. This is what is possible when you try to pair and use multiple fonts for your benefit. I hope you liked that. So today what we are going to do is look at how fonts work with each other. But before we go that far, let us try and understand how fonts can actually give off certain specific symbols, as in certain looks and feels and all of that. Now, what I've done is I've just written this as a heading. This amount of text gives me a very light, informal feeling. That is because the font I've used over here is Avenir. It is a very informal kind of a font. If I have to use a Lato, which is thin, versus an Acumen, versus a Railway, they all have slightly different looks and feels compared to each other. Therefore, the messages that they will convey will also be accordingly. For example, this is also looking fairly modern. This is Railway. Now let us say I use a font like Academy Engraved. If I take this and I use Academy Engraved, you will notice that these words now start looking very, very formal, as if they have been engraved on some surface. So the characteristic that this shows me is a slightly old style, formal characteristic. It is not young, cheerful or modern. Now instead, if I try to use some other font like an Apple Chancery, now this is the type of font that I would expect to be seeing on some kind of wedding invitation card. It's not something that I would probably see in a textbook. So that way, each kind of font has its own particular characteristic. When we use something like Baskerville, this is again very, very formal, but I would probably see this in maybe an old style book or a newspaper. Instead, if I were to maybe try a font like Avenir Condensed, this is a very narrow kind of a font. Since this is narrow, it's giving me a slight amount of difficulty to read this compared to the other one. Now, if I have to use this kind of a font, I would use it in a place where the amount of text is a lot lesser to read. What if I were to use Bodoni? All caps. Again, a very, very formal looking font. I would probably not write an informal document with this. I will not write this in or use this in a youth related web page. I would probably use this for a much more formal occasion. Let us say if I have to make an announcement on behalf of an old established institution, or if I have to create a piece of text for a very solemn occasion, such as the government is probably holding a ceremony. That is when I would actually use fonts like this. Now if I have to go for another font, let me select this again and let me try Bromello. Now Bromello is a font that looks handwritten. If you see how the strokes are, the fact that they go up and down and there is a varying in thickness, it's very clear that this is a font that is a script. It's handwritten and it has its own special characteristics. I would probably not use this to write the bulk text of an article, because if everything were to be written this way, it might give some readers a lot of visual difficulty. But I would be very happy to use this as the heading of some larger pieces of content. Now, if you look at something like a Comic Sans, again, this is structured and organized, as in it's a lot better because there is no cursive in this particular piece of text, but it is still clearly childish, as if it has been written by somebody very young. If you try and compare that with maybe a Bradley Hand, which is also looking handwritten, Or if you try and compare this with your Comic Sans again, all of these have their own characteristics. Now this font is slightly bolder, so when it's bolder it has a greater visual impact. But now if I have to change this to something like this, like a big bad robot, see, there's a lot to read. The number of words in this are a lot more, which means it's taking me a certain amount of effort to read this slowly, to identify that this is an S and this is an E. Now this is a display kind of a font. It is only used to create a certain kind of visual impact and not necessarily produce bulk text, that is articles and all of that. So I would probably not use this in a long format, but I would maybe use this as, let us say, the title of a film, where the words are only 1 or 2 at the most, like Star Wars. In contrast, you have fonts like condensed. So now whenever you have a font that looks like it has been horizontally squashed, that's called a narrow font or a condensed font. Now if I expand this, this is actually its regular size. If I stretch it even more, this is called extended. This font is called extended. Now let's bring it back to its narrow. So the more we change our fonts, the more we change the importance of the message given. What happens with a font is, very subtly, the message conveyed to students changes. If I have to substitute it for something like this, this is far more informal compared to this other font which we have just seen. Apple Chancery. This looks like it is still handwritten but cursive. This looks like it has been chiseled and printed. Both of them are italic, both of them have a slight cursive format, but look at the difference in the impression they both have created. Now if I have to select this font and maybe I change it to something else. If you see a font like this, this font is something that I would expect in some kind of fancy movie like Lord of the Rings, where it is fantasy, it is handwritten and it is specifically created for a specific format. I would probably not use this everywhere, but only in special occasions where one certain kind of style has to be conveyed. Now if I have to change this, let's say I've used Herculaneum. This is something that I would probably associate with the Greeks and the Romans and old style. If I have to probably create the opening credits of one historical movie based out of Greece, then I would use a font like this. If you notice, all of these are fonts that are special, but some fonts like some serif and some sans serif fonts are much more general. For example, if you have your Avenir, there is no particular occasion that you would assign to this. This is a font that is more universal compared to the others. On the other hand, if you have, let us say, a font like your Times New Roman, which is very, very popular among everybody. So Times New Roman is also a lot more universal because it is comfortable and it is readable on many other occasions. Only thing is, Times New Roman is more formal than Avenir. Avenir is also again similar to your Arial, which is also a very common and popular font. This is Arial. Now there is another font like this called Helvetica. Helvetica is one of the most common and popular fonts in the design industry. One of the reasons why it is so popular is because this font is free. Helvetica has some of the best designs in terms of a particular font, and it is free for use among people. Now if you notice, there are some slight differences between Arial and Helvetica. Let us look at the T. This is Arial, this is Helvetica. Look at the top of the T. Look at the end of the E. Look at how the C is cut. Now, whenever you want to see the difference between two fonts, making note of these small differences makes a lot of difference. Look at how the A is used. This has a tail, whereas this just cuts down directly. So every font has certain special characteristics to its letters. This S has a slightly diagonal feature, but this S is horizontal. So both Arial, Helvetica, these are all very standardized fonts in the industry, and because these are standardized, they can be used for more than one usage. They can be used in multiple contexts very effectively. So for those reasons, it's a good idea to use basic fonts like that. Another font which is similar to Helvetica or which has just as much is called Gill Sans. Gill Sans is slightly thicker than your Arial, but then you look at the difference. The E here extends this way and is slightly cut off. Then look at how the A is shaped in Gill Sans versus Arial. The W is wider. The C is horizontally cut. Can you see this? Sorry, vertically cut compared to the C which faces a diagonal cut over here. And look at the T here versus here. These are all small differences that make Gill Sans special. If I were to replace this, let us say, with a Futura. Let's try and find Futura. I'm going to use Futura Medium, or if there is a regular version, there's no regular. This is Futura Medium. Now look at the difference between the A here and the A here. Futura is a more geometric font. Its characteristics have more geometric shapes. Look at the corners of the W. Look at how the D is formed. Here, if you notice, the height, the X height of Arial is much more than the ascender, which is the top. Whereas the X height of a font like Futura is equal to the height of the ascender. This proportion is very different. Look at the shape of the T and the shape of the T. All of these are small things that make one font different from another. These are the minute differences between basic fonts like this. But fonts like Futura, Gill Sans, and even Helvetica, as well as Arial and Avenir, all have the characteristic that they are not restricted to one particular form of usage. They are used across multiple brands, multiple scenarios, because they don't have a particular visual quality. Whereas over here, all of these fonts have a very specific visual quality. This looks printed and formal. This looks hand chiseled old style, like you would probably expect in one Egyptian or Greek situation. This looks handwritten but printed in some way. There's a slight handwritten quality to this. Only thing is the letters are all standardized, so it does not have the irregularity of a script font. So for this reason, I would use these very carefully only in specific occasions. This is how you can look at some font and decide what its characteristics are. Now when it comes to actually pairing fonts, that is one font with another, let us give it a shot. I'm going to make this central aligned. Now, I have two lines of word here. What I want to do is develop a very specific look and feel using these words. So, this is more of an important keyword compared to this. So, I will be using two different fonts to communicate these. Now, if I were to use this as my heading, and let us say the font I have used is Railway. If I want to try pairing this with a Railway, let's see how Railway looks. Now this is slightly wide and fat and rounded. Now in order to pair with something like this, if I want to use, let us say, this font, they don't match because this is italics. Maybe I can increase the font size and make it, but they don't necessarily go together because this is italic with all of these fancy things, whereas this is straight. So typically the font I should pick should also be a nice straight font. If I use a Skia, now these two fonts are both sans serif fonts, but see, the visual characteristics of this font are too close to the visual characteristics of this. This is also rounded, but it is wider, that is vertically wider, where the D here is visually different. So it looks like these two fonts together don't match properly. Instead, if I use a font here, I should probably take a font which is much more different. If I take a font like American Typewriter, this now looks like these two fonts have been independently used, but there's not enough of a good contrast between both of them. So what I would probably do is make this bold. Now this looks like the idea is already there, but this is suddenly important, the fact that the idea has been developed well. And because it is typewritten, now I have a slightly old style feeling to it. So maybe I would associate it with a newspaper, or I would associate it with somebody typewriting an article. Slightly old style. I'll associate it with something that is based out of the 1980s and not 2020. So I would probably associate it with letter writing or something like that. But if I were to take the same thing and let us take this font and let's look at another pairing. If I were to put it here, now see, this font looks like a downgrade compared to this. So the only way I can make this an upgrade is if I were to try some tips and tricks. That is, I would have to make some kind of change to this font to make this work in comparison to this. Maybe increase the size is one trial. Will it work? Will it won't work? I don't know. We can only try. This is not really helping because Big Idea is written in a formal font. This is written in an informal school type font. So the Big Idea looks developed, but the developed well looks underdeveloped. So they are doing the opposite of each other. That is, what is written and the quality of the font don't match. Instead, this certainly works very well. Avenir next. Now this looks like this is a development on top of this. This looks fat, it looks certainly well done. Now it's a better fit, not the ideal fit. Now if I were to take this and maybe go to a specific script font, something like this. It's still not matching. The old problem that we had is still getting faced here. That is, this looks developed but this looks handwritten. So what can we do? Let us interchange the qualities of these fonts. I will put our script font over here and I will put, now let us try and reduce the sizes. If I were to make this 200 and maybe I were to make this now, this looks like Big Idea is more important than developed well, but visually the characteristics match. That is, the idea is rough, developed well looks very formal. If I want to emphasize this, maybe I can do a few things like maybe give it an underline, and if I want to add another characteristic, maybe I can add like a circle or some kind of a feature like that. Now these two look like they have been deliberately put together, so I would say this is definitely more successful, but this still needs a little bit of an improvement. So what I could probably do is use a much better font over here. So let's see this. Serif and script are not working very well in my opinion. So I can only use a sans serif font to give us a nice effect. Now this is still not giving us the impact we need. So what if we change the color? I will bring this to the front. Or I would try and place this in a certain way in comparison. And I can try and change the size of it. I can maybe try all caps. While this does give the effect of well developed, it is not helping us. What if it's small cap? Now this has a much better impact in my opinion, because see, this B and these letters, the same contrast is replicated over here. So maybe we can try an all cap, but maybe a different font. Now when you see this, see, both of these are very specific visual characteristics. This versus this, the contrast is very strong. So this is a very specific pairing that maybe we can try, but I would probably not use it for bulk text. Instead, if I were to do something else, I would probably what if I make this bold? Geneva is not working because it does not have a bold version. So I'm going to choose Avenir next and I'm going to use bold. Now this is giving me the kind of impact I want with the kind of characteristic I want, but I don't like the stroke of this. Maybe I can increase the stroke to a 16 or something. And I can edit these points a little better. I can maybe manipulate the B a little bit, and even here this probably gives me a slightly better impact compared to everything else. I might even completely eliminate it, and even without that this works really well. So these are things that you can try just to see how your fonts can be paired with each other. Remember that whenever you are pairing fonts, this is a massive exercise in itself. So I suggest you set aside a good amount of time that you can dedicate to actually developing the fonts you need for your project, be it for your heading, your subheading, or your body text. That's how you will be able to click upon the right kind of fonts that you can pair for your project.